Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, and RedBridge's Kos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. G'day, Curtinistas. Welcome back to Curtin's Cast. My name's Nick Dyrenfurth, Executive Director of the John Curtin Research Centre, co-host, and I'm joined by Kung Fu Kos Samaras. How are you, Kosi?
Good.
Another crazy week in national and global politics, Kos.
Definitely a lot of crazy stuff going on.
And we're here to unpack the craziness, Kosi. We're here to unpack the craziness for the Curtinistas. We've spent months talking about the rise of, we've actually spent a whole year talking about the rise of populism in Australia, in particular the surge of One Nation. And of course, there's something very, very real in that story, and One Nation are eclipsing the Liberals to become the clear right of centre opposition party, but it's only half the picture, as you have argued. And your latest RedBridge and Accent Research polling shows Australia is not experiencing just one populist insurgency, it's experiencing two at the same time, driven by many of the same underlying forces, economic and financial stress. Amongst Gen X voters under pressure, One Nation is polling north of 40%. Among Gen Z voters under that same pressure, the Greens are hitting similar numbers. It's the same frustration. It's the same electoral system, but completely different political destinations. So we're not just telling a story about the rise, trying to explain the story of the rise of the populist right. It's being pulled apart from two directions at once. We're also seeing that in the UK and other places. And beneath that, Kosi, is something I've been arguing in several pieces for the Australian, is in part this volatility is being driven by the unmaking of traditional class politics, the system that defined Australia for a century or more, Labor versus anti-Labor, working class versus middle class. It's no longer holding the way it once did. But the paradox is Labor looks dominant federally and in pretty much all of the states. It's holding more of its vote than the coalition who are imploding. It's winning elections. On the surface, it looks stable, but beneath the surface, there is a huge amount of instability, and that's without even coming to Donald Trump and the chaos he's inflicting upon the world economy, and the people of the Middle East, something that I have termed Trump Bump 2.0, which we might get to a little later in the episode. So, Kos, tell us about the two populisms. Why do you say we are witnessing two populisms, one of the right, one of the left?
Yeah, so when you look at Generation X, as you touched on, the party that seems to be attracting a large chunk of that generation is One Nation, predominantly from the Liberal Party and the National Party, but also to a lesser extent Labor, which we've touched on in previous episodes. Of course, when you look at Generation Z, that is Australians between the age of 18 and 28, at the moment, there's still another 5 years of Generation Z to enrol to vote.
5 million people, I think you've noted. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. That's right. They are very strongly in favour of the Greens. The Greens' primary vote amongst both male and female is around 30%, but amongst females, it's in excess of 40%. And so fundamentally what we're looking at here is a response to economic stress, hardship, because, of course, when we look at the research that we just compiled and published, individuals who report to us as experiencing extreme financial stress, if you're a Gen Xer, you're more likely to be voting One Nation. The primary vote for that particular cohort in that subgroup is 42%. When you look at Gen Z, same dynamic. Those who are reporting to us as experiencing severe financial stress, 42% are voting for the Greens. And the reason why we're having one generation's moving in one direction, the other one in the other direction, is of course all about political psychology.
It's your psychological sorting.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, younger Australians are more predisposed to a distribution type response to financial stress. They will more likely be willing to blame institutions, corporates, vested interests, power for their plight. Gen X is more about loss of agency and status. And they tend to have a much more, I would say, they have a response to the crisis that they're experiencing that has more to do with a sense that they've lost because someone else has gained. And that someone else is not always necessarily the big end of town, so to speak.
But explain actually why they've sorted that way. What actually explains the generational difference? I mean, Gen X have gone through more of the same crises, going all the way back to, as you and I have pointed out for a long time, going back to the early 1990s recession. So what is it about those two generational cohorts which is pushing them right? What is actually underlying that psychological sorting? It's not, is it,
yeah.
I mean, have Gen Z picked up Marx and Engels, Cosy, and have started reading up on Marxism? Because they've got access to the same information ecosystems, or there are a lot more online, and have been their literal identities have been formed online.
It's more about, and if you look at the types of Gen X that have moved to them, they are in the majority, as we've spoken about, from the conservative side of politics. That means their response to economic hardship is going to be very different to someone who is a Gen Xer right now and voted for Labor. So there are still very sizable numbers of Gen Xers in this country that are voting for Labor. The one team that's completely crushed in the middle is the Coalition, where their support amongst Generation X is in the low teens on a good day, combined National Party and Liberal Party. That's how bad it's become for that established conservative side of politics. So naturally, when previously conservative, aspirational Gen Xers start experiencing financial hardship, it takes a while for them to eventually break from voting for the Liberal Party or the National Party. But when that happens, it's sudden. It's like, when you go bankrupt, it's slow and then it's sudden.
Yeah, it's the famous F. Scott Fitzgerald quote.
That's right. And so it's, and we see that in history, whenever political parties or movements collapse, you could see the foundations of that collapse over a period of 2 decades. And it's definitely the case here in this country. So these voters that we're talking about, historically, Howard Battlers, voted for the Liberal Party in particular, but also the National Party, because for them, the Liberal Party represented a political brand that was going to manage the economy and reward their hard work. So they viewed the Liberals as a vehicle that was going to ensure that if they worked hard enough, they will meet their life goals. That trust, that obviously has not occurred, and we've spoken at length about that 20-year journey which these voters have embarked on, and now have come to the realization well into their 50s that whatever they were aspiring to when they were in their 30s, has not eventuated. And so their response is going to be a conservative one. Younger Australians are different.
What about within those generations, though, Cos? Are there stronger trends within income bands?
Not necessarily. So historically, we know. Or
is it lining up along education now?
Yeah, it's more. Yeah, so we can get to education in a moment, but historically, for a very long time, middle class, I wouldn't say well off, middle class constituencies with a bit of agency were more likely to offer populist right-wing options. That has now changed, because what we are seeing is people who are definitely feeling economic pressure default into that same voting behaviour. Now, the common trend for that we're seeing from an education perspective is that if you've got a TAFE or trade qualification, and you're from and you've historically voted for the Liberal Party, the National Party, you're overwhelmingly now voting for One Nation.
Yeah.
So basically, that particular cohort for the Liberal Party has completely walked. We've seen an absolute collapse of the Liberal Party's working class base. And what's left on the Liberal Party is basically a merchant class, people with property, wealth, who live in particular parts of Australia and are largely well into their 60s. That's what's left. They've been completely gutted.
And they first crossed over in the Howard years, didn't they? And
yeah.
There was a great mythology around there in the right wing commentariat about Howard's battlers, and then we had Tony's tradies, etc.
Yes,
but that looks like actually it was a short term. In the broader scheme of things, it was a short term destination.
Yeah, that's right. Because if we look at when John Howard was obviously Prime Minister, and then later on, obviously Tony Abbott, yes, some of these constituencies were experiencing a level of decline, right? So if you were living in northern part of Tasmania, the GFC had an impact on you because the timber industry contracted, small town manufacturing collapsed, actually not just in northern Tassie, but right across the country. Basically, all the industries that used to employ these people, particularly in regional Australia, whether it's abattoirs, whether it's, as I touched on, timber, agriculture, canneries, you name it, they've all been shipped overseas or closed or contracted in size. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs have been lost within these particular constituencies. And these were not entirely, but in some towns predominantly, Liberal voting, National Party voting constituencies.
You're also a sort of provocative point here, Kosy. I encourage people, get to the RedBridge Substack. Kos has been very productive there. You're also arguing that the Greens surge in the polls, and we should say this didn't materialise at the last federal election, or they polled very strongly amongst Gen Z. You're saying that people are misreading this Green surge amongst Gen Z as purely inner city phenomenon.
That's right.
It's broader and more structural.
Much broader, 100%. The support for the Greens amongst Generation Z in the outer suburbs of our large cities is just as significant as it is in the inner city. They are polling well into the 30s and 40s in the outer suburbs of our large cities amongst Generation Z. The only reason we've not seen it manifest in a very big way yet is there's just simply not enough of this generation on the electoral roll. Now, you may say, well, they'll get older and they'll change. Well, millennials pretty much have shown us that's not the case. So millennials, when they were in their 20s, were voting for the Greens to the tune of about between 15 and 20%. It's still the same. The Labor vote is still relatively the same. The only thing that's changed with the millennials is a lot of the millennials that used to vote Liberal or right-wing minor parties are now voting for One Nation. That's the only thing that's changed. Labor's two-party preferred vote for millennials is still in the mid-50s. Hasn't moved all that much. So my point here is, if Generation Z follows the same trajectory, they're not going to change their voting behaviour into their 30s. They will still be looking for that change, unless, of course, there's a material positive change in their lives, or if they think that particularly the Labor camp starts stumping up reform in a very significant way and captures their hearts and minds. Now, this is important. What this generation tells us is they don't expect silver bullets. They don't have the sort of political diet that baby boomers and Gen X have grown up on, which is give me the sugar hit now, otherwise I'll punch you at the ballot box. They know they are living in a world that has complex problems and will require complex long-term solutions. They will respect the political party if it stumps up solutions that, in many ways, the political class that's stumping them up, let's say we're talking about the Labor government here, many of those individuals won't be around to see the end of it. That will grab their attention. In other words,
housing is the perfect example. No one's
so
suggesting housing is going to be solved in this term. It's not going to be solved in the next term, and very likely it's not going to be solved the term after that. But there are symbolic reforms. That's why this budget, Kos, is so important to the identity of the Albanese Labor government. This budget is so important.
Absolutely.
If they do not move on capital gains tax, again, no one's arguing that it's going to be a silver bullet, but it's a huge sign to these Gen Zers that we're on your side and we get it.
And if you don't, the UK will happen.
You're right. So they're talking about a sort of five-party system, okay? You got the Tories
That's
who are
right.
dying, Labor's in government, struggling, Reform surging, Lib Democrats doing okay. They're going to take seats from Labor, they're going to take seats from the Tories. And then you've got the Greens who won a by-election the other week with Zach Polanski, the Green eco-populist. And he's pushing this left populism, which you're discerning in Australia, very popular amongst Gen Z. I'll tell you the other country which we could be heading towards as well, Denmark. I paid very close attention to the recent Danish election, Kossi, and what happened is, to talk about five party. It's like, I can't go through all the different parties, but the Social Democrats, who are most likely to form government, with Mette Frederiksen as leader, worst polling result in 120 years, but by far the biggest parliamentary party after the election. Okay? Who surged? Look at you've got the Green left. So the Social Democrats, 38 seats, but they lost 12 seats. Green left, 20, up 5. Red Green, up 2. Other left, 15. Moderates. Then on the centre right, we're seeing a hyper version of Australia. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fragmented parties of the centre right and far right. And voters have sorted into left and right blocks, and at the moment, it's the left bloc have the numbers marginally. But that's also a little view into our future, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And that is, again, a trend we're seeing across most Western democracies, in Europe in particular. So I think, what will happen in this country is very similar. We are probably now already living in that environment and operating in that environment. And going to your previous point or question around why the two generations separated, this is it's all about political psychology, and all of us have got different types of, I would say, different bits and pieces within us about how we view the world around us. Some of us are more economic populist. Others will be more predisposed to right-wing populism. If you run a battery test, for example, and I ask you 10 questions, and it's a carefully designed survey, we could tell whether you are more economic populist or more right-wing populist in terms of your psychological makeup. Gen X and that particular group we've been talking about, if I run the battery test with them, and I have, they will absolutely steer hard to the right. Gen Z, they steer hard to the left, purely based on all those answers. So we could actually map out the entire country by seat as to which one's more predisposed to be economic populist versus right-wing populist. And it's hardwired in psychology. And this is why when people say, well, all we need to do is change our policies and we'll win back Gen Z, that's not so easy, because you've never had them in the first place if you're on the right side of politics, and you're not going to get them, because it's just simply, they're hardwired not to respond to your view of the world in the way you think they are.
I want to dig deep into do I really want to dig deep into the one nation insurgency, Kos? And I've made some historical parallels recently. Again, I'm struck though that Gen X with the battery test going right, which would seem to be a contradiction or a paradox on face value, because if you are looking and politics is irrational, but from a rational perspective, you've had centre-right governments in power at a Commonwealth, at a federal level, for most of the last 30 years. So if they were looking to blame people for their state of affairs, why wouldn't they be blaming the right? Because the right have been in power whilst the housing crisis grew, whilst inequality grew, whilst nothing...
but then they are not going to respond to this problem by finding left-wing politics attractive. They're going to respond psychologically to the right. Hence, an alternative from the right that is more populist and promises them revenge is very, very attractive. To give you a bit of an insight, let's go into the weeds on a particular cohort that is voting for One Nation, that is Gen X, and that is second, third generation migrants, as in people who were born to migrant parents in Australia. So you think about Greeks. right? There is a subgroup within the One Nations cohort that is absolutely this group. They were born to migrant parents in a very religious, conservative world. They did not follow their parents into the factories. Most of them have gone into small business. They acquired the sort of aspirational, I would say, makeup that we see in other Australians. They were fed a diet that this is the lucky country, and that you are, if you work hard, you will acquire the things you want in life. But they were also extremely socially conservative, so very religious, but but also have very conservative values as well. Hence, when things fall apart for them, they're not going left. They'll move to the right, because when you ask them questions around, for example, the role of male and females in family environments, the role of religion in society, their answers will be very different to young Greeks, Australian Greeks, for example, Gen Z Greeks, who will have very different views about the role of male and females in society, and very different views about religion and the role of religion in society.
Oh, I know that because I grew up. A lot
Correct.
of my mates growing up are Gen X Greeks.
Yeah. They're not exactly left-wing.
I wrote a piece in the Australian the other week about One Nation. I contrasted it to, the original insurgents in Australian politics was the Labor Party, because it ripped up the old system, which was, conservatives versus protectionist liberals and also free traders there. Okay, but it was basically two sides of the liberal coin. And we're seeing similar insurgency, but the key difference is, you touched on this in your Substack. I want to get your take on this. I think we're starting to see the hard ceiling on One Nation's vote about mid-20s, and a lot of that goes, if you compare it to early Labor, so this is Labor from the 1890s up until World War I. What are the differences? Early Labor, very organised, disciplined, union-backed, had a clear class-based program, which also, but which appealed to people out there in the bush, lower middle class Australians, and a clear governing project. One Nation channels grievance. It has weak institutional depth, and it doesn't have a coherent governing model. Maybe though, because it doesn't need to have a coherent governing model. But Labor turned insurgency into power. What is One Nation going to do? Is it simply going to play this fragmenting role? I know there's some talk. We had Jeff Kennett out there urging a One Nation liberal coalition in Victoria. Is One Nation structurally incapable of becoming a governing force?
Structurally, as it stands, yes, is the answer, because I think the ceiling's a bit higher than 25. It'll be in the high 20s. And the ceiling is there because of the political psychology we've just spoken about. You cannot convert everyone to right-wing populism. It just doesn't work. It's not how everyone's wired. And this is the point I always make to political commentators, is that this notion that there's a never-ending growth pattern is just not true. And even that applies to even existing conservative voters who are sitting on the Liberal Party's pile. For example, when we survey Australians, up to 35% of them will prefer to preference Labor over One Nation. 50%, close to 50% of them preferenced Labor over One Nation in the South Australian Premier's electorate at the recent state election. So what that tells us is there's also small c conservative constituency out there that is still voting Liberal and will punish the Liberal Party if they choose to get too close to One Nation. Hence, Jeff Kennett's advice is electoral poison. If your primary Victoria is already in the 20s, and it is, the last thing you want to do is send a signal to whatever's left on your pile, and that is a sizable chunk of it, that you are going to be cuddling up to One Nation. And for this particular group, they could walk straight over to Labor's camp. We saw that in 2018 at the state election in Victoria. We've seen this in Western Australia, and or to a certain extent in South Australia as well, where small c conservatives, when faced with the relocalisation of the traditional party they've been voting for, will opt for a centralist option. This is where I think the Labor Party brand in South Australia was so attracted to this cohort. So I think that yes, there's a ceiling. Can they convert it to power? No, They will need to form coalitions with other right-wing parties to form government. Those other right-wing parties at this present time cannot do that because, as I've just explained, it's electoral poison for them. They will lose whatever's left of their base, or portion of it, to others if they do it.
Yes, and that's where I point out the historical analogy that I drew upon, the making of the two-party system in Australia, which was formalised in 1910, which led to the world's first majority Labor government, COSI, under Andrew Fisher, winning control of both houses of Parliament in 1910. It's hard to see what we saw in 1909 was a so-called fusion. So a formal coalition between the old free traders based in New South Wales, the Liberal protectionists based in Victoria, and you had Conservatives who were led by John Forrest, who was based in Western Australia. We're not going to see a fusion on the right between One Nation and the Liberal Party.
No, and really the only option the Liberal Party has is to work out a way to bring back some of that lost support. And you and I have discussed at length about who that individual may be and what sort of policy framework they need to be offering up. I thought Andrew Hastie's interview on Insiders was quite telling in terms of putting forward a narrative and approach, a political approach that does appeal to this particular voter we're talking about.
You took the words right out of my mouth, Kos. I was just about to move on, Hastie. I could even sing for Curtinistas here. You took the words right out of my mouth.
Correct.
We won't do that again on Curtin's Kos. I thought he was very impressive on Insiders.
Yes.
It's not like everyone in Australia was tuning into Insiders, but I thought it was a very impressive performance. He looked and sounded like a leader, and there's been a huge amount of commentary about that appearance, and he can think for himself. He reiterated something which I picked up on 12 months ago. He's not interested in making a last stand for neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. He seems to be interested in actually tackling really existing problems, and that which can actually, like sovereign capability, like housing. He has an open mind about capital gains and negative gearing.
That's right. And his open mind also extends to the well-being of this country, right? And he was asked about Trump, for example, and he's been very clear and very, very different to some of his colleagues with regards to Trump and the Trump administration, its attitudes to Australia. And I think the tone that he struck there is a far more, I would say, it's a tone that many, many Australians would accept because, well, I don't think the Trump administration is doing itself any favours when it comes to Australia and what Australians think of it. I mean, especially after not only what's going on globally at the moment in the Middle East, but also his recent announcement to basically slap 100% tariffs on Australian pharmaceuticals, purely because Australia refuses to undermine its PBS system.
Which Aussies love, Kos.
They need.
Which
Aussies need, right? They cannot survive without cancer-saving drugs. Anyone who finds themselves on the side of Trump in Australian politics is going to be in a lot of trouble at the ballot box.
Yes, this brings me to, I don't mean to be too self-referential, but I've been talking about your work. I wrote an article for the Oz last week on Trump Bump 2.0. We saw the first Trump bump play out in the Australian election, the Canadian election of 2025, when Trump was waging his tariff wars, including against allies, and there was leaders who had cozied up to him were punished at the ballot box, and all of a sudden you had incumbents holding on to office, whereas in previous sort of post-COVID elections they'd been turfed from office across the Western democracies. And I do wonder whether we're seeing a similar phenomenon work out here, Kos, and whereas you would typically assume that incumbents would be punished for the economic pain that Australians are feeling, a renewed cost of living crunch, inflation surging again, pain at the Bowser. There's a sense that as this Trumpian chaos envelops the world, as I noted, Australians are looking to, and you said on your Substack piece too, Australians are looking for who is the adult in the room. They're interested in stability and national sovereignty. So they're not asking who's to blame. That they're looking like who's the adult who can keep their head in this time of crazy geopolitics and economic uncertainty.
And you've just highlighted Pauline Hanson's biggest Achilles heel, because she has consistently praised him over many, many years and is seen as close to him. This is particularly going to be a problem for One Nation when it comes to what we call the red One Nation voter, that is a person who has historically voted for Labor and thinking about voting for One Nation. There is a portion of that. The reason why the Labor Party primary is fairly stable is because there's underneath the surface, yes, it's lost support to One Nation in particular geographies, as we've probably spoken about in previous podcasts, but it's also hoovered up some support from other parties also, to a certain extent, the Liberals. But this particular voter that has got a history with Labor and is thinking about in One Nation reports to us some of the most deepest levels of dislike towards the Trump administration out of any Australian. So if you are seen by this particular group of Australians as being a fan of Trump, you can find yourself in a bit of bother. And I think this is where I think Pauline Hanson's Achilles heel exists. Not necessarily amongst her entire base, but a portion of it.
No, I mean, I spotlighted what she said last week. She wrapped the Australian government. She said that, mates and allies pick up the phone to an ally and say, what do you need? How can we help? As I said, she had it backwards, Cods. She had it backwards. I'll tell you what happens. If the president of the USA decides to launch a war against Iran, a country of 90 million people, in really difficult, anyone from the defence establishment and defence thinkers will tell you that you had to be really prepared for that, and you needed your allies. If you launch that war and then look behind and then express shock that the cavalry aren't coming in behind you, well, then that's not on Anthony Albanese. That's not on the NATO leaders. That's why I said, Hanson's wrapped herself in the flag for 30 years, but maybe enough of that cohort will agree with my conclusion that she's all costume, no country, and being seen to be on the side of Trump when Australia has the Australian government. This is not just me boosting up Labor, but I mean I don't see what else they could have done here. There's been no formal request for them to sort of send military assets and hardware or troops. And we're not in the position, as Hasty pointed out, to send the Navy to the Middle East.
That's right.
They've reacted very coolly and calmly, and despite Trump losing the plot on social media, as I think it's really, really dangerous for Hanson. It's why I think that it's another reason why I think there's that hard cap of mid to high 20s for her party.
And we asked the question in our recent poll that we published in the Financial Review as to who they blame for the fuel crisis, and there'll be no surprise to anyone listening to this podcast that the majority of Australians blame Trump. It's also should be no surprise to anyone that a number of premiers across the country now are calling it Trump's oil crisis. And if you're going to attach yourself politically to that, you're going to get a bit of a rude shock in the ballot box. So yes,
and we are seeing hints of that. We're seeing that across Europe. Giorgia Meloni, she suffered not electoral defeat, but constitutional referendum. She was badly defeated. Your favourites, Cozzy, Gen Z voted against her. I think it was 35% against her. We had in Slovenia the centre-left hold on against the right. I just mentioned the Danish election.
Yes.
That centre-left-led government had been in power for 2 terms. Okay? So they were asking for a third term effectively. Now, Meta Frederickson also stood up to Trump. Now, that didn't prevent her party, bleeding votes, especially to its left, that sorting within the left bloc. But it certainly helped standing up to Trump over the issue of Greenland. We've seen in France, the National Rally didn't perform as well in recent elections, and they've been in behind the Trump. The one really important election, obviously radically different country and electoral system to Australia. I'll be keeping a close eye on Hungary too, to see how Viktor Orban, who's the darling of Vladimir Putin and the MAGA crowd, I'll be very interested to see how that plays out, because the polls say he's going to lose.
Well, wouldn't be surprised. Because what's happening now is that the Trump administration has created an environment where all its former allies and their relevant populations view the US as, I wouldn't say an opponent, but a nation state that is operating not in the best interest of them. So if we were to go out and survey Australians right now and we ask them the question, do you think America's actions of the last 6 months has been to the benefit of Australians? I think you know what the answer is going to be.
Yes.
And it will cut it right across political divides. And it won't necessarily be confined to just left-wing voters. It will go right into One Nation's base. In fact, a sizable chunk of the One Nation vote blamed Trump for the fuel crisis.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And I would think a sizable amount of Trump's base, MAGA base in the US, they're up in arms. But very interesting to see J.D. Vance, very quiet J.D. Vance, because he realises that their political project, this political project, whilst based on sort of cultural nationalism, nativism in the US, it was expressly based on not the US not involving itself in multiple wars, particularly in getting bogged down in the Middle East quagmire. So it looks like, and I'll be interested in your take on the American electoral politics here, that the Republicans would more than likely lose the House and the Senate at the midterms.
We are seeing some pretty extraordinary results in the US already in certain ballots across the country where the Republicans have been routed in very significant numbers. We're also obviously seeing the split in the MAGA base and the what's called the sort of MAGA podcast ecosystem is already turned on Trump and very critical of the military action, and going to your point where he promised the American public that he was going to end
no forever wars.
Right. Well, there's a forever war underway right now, and he has, for whatever reason, decided to embark on this strategy, and it will not only, I would say, result in a pretty significant result against the Republicans at midterms, but also I think it will leave his legacy in an absolute bin fire.
Bin fire is a good way of putting it. Kos, wonderful talking to you as always. I think we're going to be talking a lot more about Trump bump 2.0, yes. Trump bump 3.0, and global chaos and instability, and the rise of these left and right populism. So thank you very much for your insights and candor again on this episode. Thank you to Curtin for tuning in once again. Check us out on Apple, Spotify and YouTube. But until now, it's ciao. Till then, it's ciao and arrivederci.